And the book is titled The Euro and the Battle of Ideas. Markus is a macroeconomics and finance expert. He is the director of the Bendheim Center for Finance at Princeton University. He is the Sanford Professor of Economics at Princeton. Harold is an economic historian and an economist. He's a professor of History and International Affairs, again at Princeton. He is the Kelly Professor of European Studies. And the book is co-authored with a third author, who is Jean-Pierre Landau, who is not with us tonight. Jean-Pierre Landau was a deputy governor of the Bank of France. He was also an executive director at the IMF. And again, the title of the book is The Euro and the Battle of Ideas. The third book that we will hear about tonight, that we will discuss tonight, is titled Europe or Not, Italy Has to Change. So this is a book by Luigi Zingales, and the book will focus on Italy primarily, but Italy is also paradigmatic of the problems of the Eurozone. Luigi is also a finance expert and a macroeconomist. He's a professor of entrepreneurship and finance at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Indeed, he is the Cormack Distinguished Service Professor. Luigi is also a commentator on Italian newspapers and media in general. He is, in fact, a very influential public intellectual in Italy, talking about markets and about economic affairs. Indeed, I had a number of friends of mine contacting me, giving me special messages they have for Luigi. They hope he will follow upon afterwards. No. People you need to talk to, facts you need to know, etc. I'm also very happy to introduce my co-moderator, who is Moreno Bertoldi. Moreno is the special advisor to the ambassador of the European Union delegation in the United States. He was a chief economist at the Commission in Brussels, and he will share with me the pleasure and the responsibility of moderating the panel that we have tonight. So we are organizing their presentation in two parts. In the first part, each of the authors will speak for about 10 minutes, giving us a brief overview of the book, and we reserve the right to ask them short questions. In the second part, Moreno and I will ask more extended questions of the three panelists, and we will leave the last half hour or so for question and answers from the public. I would also like to thank the various institutions at Columbia who co-sponsored this event: the Technology, Media and Communication Specialization at CIPA, the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, the Center on Global Economic Governance at CIPA, the European Institute, and the European Union's Getting to Know Europe program. I should also remind you that the event is on record and is being filmed. So now I will cede the word to the authors, and we'll begin with Harold and Markus, Harold James and Markus Brunnermeier, on Europe as a battle of ideas.
Thank you, Alessandra. It's an enormous pleasure to be here and to be part of this fascinating discussion of really very, very different interpretations of what the problem is in Europe and what the solutions might be. So we start really from the position that the euro has not been a disaster. There's a tremendous political investment in the euro. It's an answer to a coordination problem. It's in a way an answer to a coordination problem that is not just a European issue, but in the 1980s there was this big discussion about global currency coordination, and the euro emerged out of some of the debates that took place at that time. But then there's obviously also a dramatic problem that has emerged after the global financial crisis, and particularly after 2009, 2010. And so we describe this problem in the book. Not so much in terms of the institutional inadequacies, but in terms of a fundamental clash of ideas. And we get to this clash of ideas because it struck us when we were thinking about the crisis that this is, after all, a European Union composed of 28 members and a currency bloc with 18 or 19 members. It changed in the course of the writing the book. But most people, when they think about it, really forget about all the many, many members of the European Union and the Eurozone and really concentrate on just two countries. And that's right, because the power really shifted in the course of the crisis away from the Commission and away from the European institutions and back to national capitals, and particularly to two capitals, to Paris and Berlin. And we really see the moment that the crisis becomes a general European crisis as opposed to being a crisis that's mostly about a specific problem in Greece and a specific problem in Ireland, becomes a general European crisis with a bilateral meeting in October 2010 between Chancellor Merkel and President Sarkozy, where bilaterally, without the consultation with the other governments, without the consultation with the European institutions, they produce an agreement that reflects a moderation between a French view and a German view, and which leads immediately to a dramatic widening of the spreads and the generalization of the crisis. In the course of the crisis, we then talk about the way in which the power shift towards these two centers gets more and more lopsided and more in the direction of shift towards Berlin. It then seems to us that it's really important to explain where these different principles come from, because in Deauville, this event in October 2010 that set off the problems, in Deauville, the French are insisting, President Sarkozy is insisting on a watering down of the fiscal criteria, and Chancellor Merkel is insisting on private sector involvement in writing down government debt, but not immediately, but with 3 years gap. And the result of this is the story of the crisis. So we have a world, and Markus is going to talk about it in a moment in more detail, we have a world in which Germany seems to be standing for, if you think of the famous economic discussion between rules and discretion, Germany is for rules and France is for discretion. Germany thinks that there's a fundamental solvency problem that needs to be addressed. France treats problems as basically liquidity problems where there's a requirement to inject new liquidity. So for France, there are multiple equilibria. It's a much more Anglo-American view of the world. There are multiple equilibria, and Germany finds it uncomfortable to deal with multiple equilibria. There isn't really even a good German word for multiple equilibria. In terms of fiscal policy, France is Keynesian and Germany is insisting on rules. And so that's the insistence on rules that's being diluted in the October 2010 agreement at Deauville. And some people say that this deep division is a really permanent one, that it's built maybe into the political structure because federal countries need rules a lot more than centralized countries do. In centralized countries, it's much easier for a monarch in the center or the president of the republic to snap his fingers and make a decision. And federal countries like the United States or Switzerland or the Federal Republic of Germany really need rules all the time. So some people think it's very, very deep in the historical structure. But what fascinated us when we thought about this was the reflection that actually it's not that deep, and that these responses are characteristic of the second half of the 20th century. They formed in the middle of the 20th century in response to the enormous crisis of Europe's politics, Europe's society, Europe's economy. In the 19th century, if you were asked which is the country of classical economic liberalism, of laissez-faire, where the word laissez-faire is obviously coming from, it's France. It's the world of Bastiat and Say and Le Rabouillieu. And Germany is the country where the state changes and shifts the course of the economy. But in the course of the 1930s and 1940s, in this enormous crisis with the rise of National Socialism, the Nazi dictatorship, the war, Germans retreat from that because they think that states that can manipulate things arbitrarily are dangerous and need to be constrained by rules. And for France, on the other hand, the liberal laissez-faire state of the 1930s is actually responsible for the defeat of France, because in the 1930s, budgetary orthodoxy meant, above all, cutting the military budget, and so the super austerity programs of Pierre Laval were responsible for the weakening of France militarily in the face of the Nazi challenge. So we end with this rather optimistic note in the sense that if you can change your views in the face of a really deep crisis, is it not the case that the European crisis today is so deep and so profound and so much of an existential challenge that it is actually at the moment encouraging the alteration of mentalities? And in particular, since 2014, the addition of new crises, we're not just in the euro crisis, we're in the security crisis after the invasion, annexation of Crimea, the fighting in eastern Ukraine, the disintegration of Syria, disintegration of Libya, the refugee crisis, the prompt and energy crisis. All these things make for a general European crisis and the crisis of democracy. And in that kind of crisis, it looks to us like the kind of existential crisis that Europe faced in the middle of the 20th century, and where rethinking is not only necessary, but inevitable. Markus is going to take over now.
So I also would like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present our book here, and it's a pleasure to be here. So what I want to do is I would like to crystallize a little bit where the differences are, to analytically see more stark, the black and white fashion, where is the French and the German way of thinking are so different. And I want to group it into 4 dimensions. The first one, which is the Karen already mentioned, is rules versus discretion. But actually it's not so simple. It's not the case that the French only like discretion and the Germans only rules. In particular, what you see when you look at it is that from a French perspective, in certain dimensions, there are very, very strong commitments. So they commit essentially not to default on debt at all, or they commit to a certain currency peg, or not to exit the currency union. They're much stronger in their commitment, but because they're so strong in certain dimensions in their commitment, they have to manage very actively the other dimensions. So the French way of thinking is to have very strong, powerful commitment, never default, never get out of currency tag or currency union. So that's why, in Maastricht Treaty was never written down how you would exit a currency union. Like a very, very costly, we call this a straitjacket commitment. But then on the other dimensions, which are still flexible, you have to be extremely active in the management of the crisis or whatever you do. While for the Germans, managing a crisis, you always favor one group over the other group. It has huge political problems. That's why Germans are much more for safety valves. So if rules, it's empty, everything is automatically specified, and you would like to have safety valves in all dimensions rather than having very, very strict commitments in some dimensions and then you have to manage very actively other dimensions. So that's essentially the rules versus discretion debate. That's how we see it in the book and how we describe it and how it played out. Again, it played out very strongly in the Nobel decision, where Chancellor Merkel, after not being able to push in some stricter rules on the Stability and Growth Pact, said, okay, let's at least have some debt restructuring possibilities, and this gives some market discipline back to debt, and that essentially keeps a lid on constantly increasing debt levels. The second dimension, and that's also what Harold mentioned already before, is this liquidity versus solvency aspect, where essentially from a French perspective, very longer like the Anglo-American perspective, you have a liquidity problem, and you just need a big bazooka and just show a lot of force and money out there, and the problem will go away. And it could be that you have to intervene a little bit, chip in a little bit of money, but it's always worth. It's a positive NPV problem. While from a German perspective, it is always a solvency problem. So most of the time, it is the case that it's in between. You don't know what it is, but if there is doubt, one side is drifting to a liquidity problem, the other side is drifting to a solvency problem. So you might say, it is a liquidity problem if you put in some funds, some euros, and then you get the positive NPV project essentially out of it, so some bailout is actually worthwhile doing. But you have to compare, what is the payoff you get when you bail out versus what is the payoff you don't bail out. And the latter depends very much what are the spillover, the damaging effects of systemic risk. And there's also a difference how they see it. So, for example, the French always would say this has huge systemic implications. There are huge spillover effects. And one classical example where this played out was essentially Cyprus in the spring of 2013, where there was a danger that this would spill over when you make a bail-in arrangement for Cyprus. But the Germans said, if Cyprus is systemic, then everything is systemic. And we can forget the no bailout rule and any of these considerations. And pushed very hard, and they said it's impossible to use our taxpayers' money to bail out Russian oligarchs who mostly own the Cyprus deposits. And that's pushed through a bailout regime. There was a huge shift from a bailout mentality before Cyprus to a bail-in mentality after Cyprus, and this led to a new rule for all over Europe to have this bail-in mentality now, which we will now see, I think Luigi will talk about in the Italian bail-in procedures, which are applicable in particular from January this year onwards. Now, if you think everything is a liquidity problem, then being solidarity is easy because there are essentially no costs associated with that. So the third dimension is, on the French side, there's a huge solidarity principle. On the German side, it's a so-called liability principle. So if you think it's not costly to provide some funds, because at the end it will not cost much, primarily a liquidity problem, you'd be very much in favor of solidarity, and that's essentially the French perspective. And you see whenever some packages had to be passed to the French parliament, it went through like this, while the German parliament, there were huge debates and delays and all that, so it was very different attitude. The Germans have very much a liability principle, which says if you are in charge, you are liable. You get the upside, but you also get the downside. So the liability principle is very strongly enshrined in German thinking. And that's why the Germans, they would say, we can pass on control to Brussels. If we pass on the control to Brussels, then we can have some joint system. But as long as the control of spending is at the national capital, we can not have joint liability in terms of some Eurobond. So that liability principle is very, very strongly pronounced. And then finally, the fourth dimension is about stimulus versus austerity or reform efforts. There's a lot of debate in the media how this is perceived. And I think one aspect I would just want to highlight is that, if you have a Keynesian perspective, the time when you want to do reforms is in good times. There are some extra surpluses there because everything is growing, and then you can restructure the economy, do some structural reforms. It's much easier to do it in good times. In many of our models, it's the case when you're at zero lower bound, you don't want to reform at all because any productivity enhancement is actually counterproductive. While the German perspective is much more from a political economy perspective. They say you can only push reforms through in times of crisis. There's no way in good times you can push reforms through. The famous TINA principle. There is no alternative. When you stand against the war, that's when you can push reform through. And Germany did it in the 2000s. That's how we did it in the 2000s. The others have to do it now. Or they did it in the 1950s. It was a very decisive moment, but it worked very well subsequently for Germany. That's why the attitude is so different. I think these are the 4 dimensions which we crystallized in the book, which make it very stark in a black and white fashion, of course, in order to make it more standing out. And that's what we point out in the book. Yes, essentially this part of the book we call the Maastricht ghost, the ghost of Maastricht, because these 4 dimensions played already during the Maastricht negotiations. What was missed in the Maastricht negotiations was the more financial aspect. So that's what we call the Maastricht stepchild. Because essentially when Maastricht was negotiated in the early 90s, the Southeast Asia crisis hadn't happened, and they were not aware at the time of this huge spillover effects and systemic risk components. And that's essentially which plays out later on. So if you look at the old literature, the optimal currency area, a la Mandel and so forth, banks don't play any role. There are no banks in this model. But what we saw in the run-up of the crisis, there were huge capital flows across borders, primarily short-term funded through banks. So German savers saved with their savings account, and they didn't know that the banks did very short-term funding to the peripheral countries, which was very unstable and unraveled later on. Now let me just say one more word. So Europe in general is the European integration process to a large extent is also to bring sound institutions to the periphery. So when Portugal joined, Spain joined, dictatorships were replaced with democracies, and Europe was extremely helpful to bring sound institutions to the periphery. And the euro was seen as another way of this step to bring sound institutions to the periphery, and to a large extent that's the case. So if you talk to many Greek people I talk to, they say, oh, please don't leave us alone, take us the euro away, because we need some sound institutional framework imposed by Europe, otherwise the corruption of our own politicians will lead us out. Now going forward, and I'm running out of time, is that we make various proposals in the book as well, what to do. And one particular I would like to mention is this European Safe Bond, these SPs, which nicely reflect the French perspective and the German perspective. So what's this idea? The idea is to pool all the 19 sovereign bonds, 60%, up to 60% of GDP, and then you issue a senior bond and a junior bond. So you essentially buy up a part of the sovereign debt, but then you issue a senior bond which is protected by the junior bond. If there are some defaults on the sovereign debt, then the junior bond will be hit first and provide some protection for the senior bond. So on the one hand, you don't violate the liability principle, because each government is still liable for its own debt. There's no joint liability. On the other hand, you also create a safe asset which is default free. So if you want to conduct monetary policy, if you want to switch off flight to safety, right now, if you have the crisis becomes more severe, there are flight to safety capital flows across borders from the periphery to the core to Germany. Germany provides a safe haven and a safe asset to the German Bund, the German government debt. But this is provided by one government. This way, if you design it that way, you create a European safe bond and you have a European safe asset. So you have that flight to safety will occur from the junior bond to the senior bond, and both are European bonds. So you can do this without a treaty change, with very little intervention essentially. And this will actually be one step forward. We provide many other ideas, how to close firewalls and so forth, but let me leave it at that. We are at the end optimistic because we three authors, we found a way forward too. We have different views. In the beginning we were battling on our own to get to a common view, and I think there is a way forward, in particular because you have so many crises now to solve, and if you have many dimensions to bargain over, it's easier than you have only one dimension, Germany against Greece. You have many dimensions where Germany and the Greek interests are aligned. But the first thing is we have to have a common understanding how different our thinking is, and that's what we hope that the book will point out to many policymakers and academics.
Thank you very much. I do have one question. You began your presentation saying we think that it has been a successful example of coordination, of policy coordination. Then you immediately told us that in fact the discussion shifted to the national government, the decided to pass on Germany and in fact to Germany. So where is it?
So, you know, I'm a historian who's dealt with really extreme examples of the failure of coordination. You know, I started off, I spent the first decades of my academic life thinking about the Great Depression, and this is much better than the Great Depression. In the sense that we just didn't have the Great Depression, and we're coordinating.
I have also another question that is also related to that. I mean, when I was reading your book, I arrived at the chapter, and there is a they need to continue, not because it was not interesting, but to the end, but because you're right. The Euro crisis management saw a remarkable shift of the gravity of power from European institutions and the European process to national capitals, in particular Berlin and Paris after Deauville. After the Deauville decision, Paris lost out, and the old Franco-German axis tilted in outside direction that was German. So the question is, I mean, was the battle idea of ideas after that really relevant in the Euro area, or to take another historic example, the battle of Bretton Woods, when Dexter, White and Keynes disagreed, at the end it was the US which won because the sheer power was there. So why do you think that the battle of ideas was more relevant in this case, despite the fact that there was a shift in power?
So I would say actually it looks like Germany is the most powerful one, but if you look at many things, it actually happened the French way. So Mario Draghi's intervention, for example, in 2012, whatever it takes, is very much a liquidity perspective, and it also turned out to be a liquidity phenomenon, and solved this way. If you look at the ESM, so many institutional arrangements which were made, which were initially, the Germans were very hesitant, but then it just became reality, but however with a delay. So I wouldn't say that everything was just brushed aside and Germany took over. Intellectually, I think the other side brought a lot to the table as well and pushed already many things through. So that's why I think it's, at the end, Germany was essentially blocking, but only delaying essentially.
And I think also you should add that Germany is just not as powerful, it's not very comparable to the United States in 1945. The United States in 1945 is in a unique position.
So first of all, I have to thanks to be invited in such a distinguished panel, and I have to warn you that my book does not exist, at least in English. It does exist in Italian. It was written 2 years ago. If you are really interested, I have an unofficial translation in English, if you want the idea. But the book was really conceived for the Italian market for a very simple phenomenon, that Italy is divided into two camps. One camp of people that blames the euro, in particular Germany, for everything. If it rains, it's fault of the euro. And the others that have what I call a orthopedic view of Europe, that we are a rotten nation, and only with the German discipline we can actually function. And in the middle of the 2010-11 crisis, I met a distinguished Italian banker who said we should give our premiership to Angela Merkel. She should run the country for us. And I'm actually stunned that an intelligent person can think that, and not because Angela Merkel is not good. Angela Merkel is great. I think is one probably of the best leaders of the 21st century, even if it's short, but it's of the 21st century. But she always ran Europe with the interest of the Germans in mind, and cannot be otherwise because she's not the elected president of Europe. I was stunned that his very leading Italian economist, when he was comparing Europe and the United States, said President Obama and Angela Merkel. Wait a minute, Angela Merkel, she's not the president of Europe. She only responds to the German electors. How could we possibly have sort of a European Union in which one country rules? One of the great things about the United States is back then you realize a system that many people hate, but of a Senate, and every state, including Wyoming, that has more cows than people, have 2 senators. And that produces a balance in power, which is important because back then, Virginia would have ruled the Union, and after that, New York, and probably today would be California. And if the United States is actually a union and not simply a collection of states, is because there is a common system. So I wanted to express this sort of tension to an Italian public, explaining the situation and trying to show what the problems are that Italians have to blame only themselves, and what are the problems that actually are associated with the euro. And because sort of Joe spent most of his time blaming the euro for everything, I will be light on that front. But not because I disagree. I think the euro has a lot of responsibilities. In particular, I want to be very clear. The euro is not sustainable without a common fiscal policy. And until basically Germany decides which kind of fiscal policy they want, I don't care, as long as they want one. And if they don't want any, let's sort of recognize that the marriage is finished and we should actually find other ways, because there is a worse thing that divorcing is to stay in an unhappy marriage. And I think that I want to describe to you how dramatic is the situation in Italy, because I'm sorry, I'm too Italian for sitting here and say the euro is not a disaster, and after all, we're much better than the Great Depression. First of all, it's not true for most countries. Italy certainly not. The Great Depression was light vis-a-vis what we have today. So we are much worse than the Great Depression. This is true for Greece and many other countries. So sitting from Germany, that is actually growing fast and well, saying that it's not a disaster is sort of not really compassionate in my view. Because Italy is a tragedy. So let me show a bit of this. Italy grew very well. We had something that was called the Italian miracle, okay? And the 60s, 70s, and 80s grew very fast. This is per capita income. We stopped growing, and per capita income today is as low as 20 years ago. So 20 years have been missing here of growth. This is what the miracle was, has become a curse. Actually, there is a joke in Italy that in the 50s we're growing at 6%, in the 60s at 5%, in the 70s, and I keep going, and then you go to the 10s, which is 0%. So it's been a straight line, and we're not looking for the 20s because are going to be a negative rate. And so there's no growing income for 20 years. Also, and this is saying no productivity growth. So if you look at other countries, like Japan, Japan has not grown a lot in terms of GDP, but why? Because Japanese started to revert in terms of number of hours work per week. They were working like crazy. They now converge to the average, not yet, but towards. So they cut down the number of hours. So the productivity per hour work in Japan kept growing in the last 20 years at a very healthy rate. The only country, actually the only 2 countries, Italy and Spain, they see the black part is actually negative for Italy and very small positive for Spain. So Spain grew a lot since the introduction of the euro, but most of this growth was to employ people that were not employed before. So using what is called the extensive margin, not the intensive margin, which is productivity. So Italy has not grown for 20 years in terms of productivity. Now, part of it is because we arrived to the euro, this is our past since, we arrived to the euro with a gigantic amount of debt. This was accumulated back in the 80s, and so we had to pay for that amount of debt, and that was a big burden. But we have also a lot of responsibilities in terms of a country that doesn't work and is not at the level of the technological frontier, especially in terms of institutions. So Italy is low in every dimension, from official public sector to my favorite measure is a measure of meritocracy. So how much you promote people based on merit and not based on connections. And here there is a clear divide that is remarkably north and south. Denmark and Finland are at the top, and Spain and Italy are at the bottom. And this, as I will explain if I have time later, has huge impact on the ability of Italy to actually compete in the 21st century. So if you produce t-shirts, you don't need to have a very meritocratic system to produce t-shirts. If you want to produce sort of high-tech stuff using frontier technology, you need to have a very meritocratic system. And that's what Italy is missing, and it's all our fault. So the Germans are not responsible, Europe is not responsible, the euro is not responsible, okay? This is completely our fault, and part of the Italian system thought that if we join the Europe and euro, we will be forced, this is the orthopedic view, we will be forced to get into shape. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. In fact, paradoxically, and this is part of some bad rules of the euro is what permitted Berlusconi to stay for 20 years with no fiscal crisis. Because if we had an exchange rate, there would be a run on the lira the moment Berlusconi is elected president. And paradoxically, the euro is what permitted Berlusconi to stay in power and spend a huge amount of money. There is a very simple statistic that shows how much we wasted the benefit of the euro. If we were to take all the savings in terms of reduced interest of joining the euro and use to pay down the debt, we would have arrived to the fiscal crisis in 2007 with a debt to GDP ratio as low as the German one. Okay, so it's not that our fiscal policy was so crazy, it's that we did not use the savings, the benefits of joining the euro to actually pay down the debt. We spent, this was part of Berlusconi, we spent and we pay for it. An example of our coincidence is the fact that Italy, for example, export of technology, the proportion of export of technology has been going down in the last 12 or 13 years instead of going up. If you compare the number with Germany, it is exactly the other way around. Then we have a component of Eurosins. The fact we cannot devalue, it makes Italian export much less competitive. And you say, but what about the Germans? I think that there was a very clear strategy, in my view, of Germany to compete, to do a competitive devaluation, not on the base of the currency, but on the base of salaries. And it was very smart of Germany. What is their competitive advantage? Is they have better industrial relationships so that they can convince workers to take nominal pay cuts. This would be unthinkable in Southern Europe. Okay? And so they start playing the deflationary game. And we cut your salary more than you, and who can follow? And surprise, surprise, Southern Europe could not follow and lost in competition. But this is not any different than beggar your neighbor policy of devaluation in the 30s. It's done through salaries rather than through sort of the exchange rate. But then we have some scenes that are entirely driven by the European structure. And one is deflation. We have a system, James was talking about a preparation of France for World War II. They built a gigantic Maginot Line to defend against in the wrong place with the wrong technology. That's the European Central Bank, my friends. Has been designed to fight the last war. The last war was inflation, and we created the perfect system with all the inflexibility of the German rules in order to make that irreversible. And it is irreversible, but unfortunately, they're there to fight the other war. It's like you go to Hong Kong and they had all the installation in the wrong place because they were expecting an attack from the sea in World War II and came from the land. So they couldn't shoot a bullet. Okay? That's the European Central Bank. The second is the fake of the banking union. Markus said correctly that Germans respect rules. So there was a rule agreed in 2012 that there would be a banking union with 3 pillars: bail-in, common supervision, and a joint insurance pay at the European level. We went through 1, we went through 2. When it came to 3, the Germans said, oh, I forgot, I need another rule in order to introduce 3. if this was done by Italians, we said, oh, the usual guy that bargain and renegotiate all the time, untrustworthy. But because they're the Germans, not only they did it, but nobody blamed them for doing that. And I don't know why, if I were the Prime Minister of Italy, I would never be, but every meeting, the first thing I would say is, please follow the rules when you introduce the banking union. The third point is the common fiscal policy. The common fiscal policy is not going to come anytime soon. And the elastic standards, we know that the rules, we're joking about the rules imposed here, and they said, I'm going to impose the rules of timing as imposed by the Fiscal Stability Pact. And I said, yes, those rules are elastic. If you're powerful, you keep talking, and that's what I'm doing. And if you're not powerful, you get screwed. And that's exactly what what Europe is about. So, at this point, I thought that joining the Euro for Italy was a very reasonable thing to do. Now, the question is, what we should do. And the cost of getting out, I disagree with Joe on this, the cost of getting out, especially if done unilaterally, are enormous. But my big fear, and I leave you with this image, my big fear is the famous story of the frog. If you put a frog in the boiling water, jumps out because it's too hot. If you put a frog in cold water, and then you turn the temperature slowly, the frog never feels the differential of temperature, and so eventually end up being cooked. Okay? So this is exactly Italy in the Euro. Is cooked slowly, and does not have the power to jump out, does not have the strength to jump out, but eventually it's going to be born. Thank you.
Thanks, Luigi. Thanks also for giving an example of how Italy interprets the rules in the parties this forum. I have a question just your last image, I mean, the frog in the pot. The problem is that the temperature of the water is not exogenous. So if the frog tries to move up, the temperature becomes very, very hot. Why? I mean, and we are seeing now with Brexit and so on. I mean, there is no institutional mechanism that you have in place doesn't allow you to leave the currency during a weekend. You would have an enormous reaction by the market, by the people, and so on, because you have to leave the euro and the European Union and coming back. And that takes months, if not years. And everybody ran out before the Poland. If you have 2 euros as Joe suggests, what you would have is that a complete outflow of capital run out. And until you are in the union, you have to respect all the rules. So I fear that it's not so simple as you and also described.
No, I completely agree with you. I think that that's a very good point in modifying the example of the frog. My fear is exacerbated by what you're saying, because in a sense, the union has enough flexibility to realize to change the temperature so that the frog will never jump out, but there is no mechanism to make sure that the frog is not cooked at the end. And actually, I use an analogy. I don't know how many of you know Italian history here, but I use an analogy in my book that I'm very sort of attached to, because nobody pays attention, but I think it's very important. An analogy between the Italian unification and the European unification. And the two are very similar, because both of them were big ideas driven by a small elite that basically threw it down the throat of everybody else, saying, you idiot don't understand how great this is, just take it and you will see. And all of them, both of them, ended up having the North ruling the South. And we know what happened to Italy is the South is a disaster. And people don't know that Sicily had the same per capita income of Emilia-Romagna, where Bologna is, when Italy got unified. And today is much, much lower. Okay? And people blame mafia, but mafia has helped the North rule the South. and by the way, has helped the American land in Sicily. So it's been used by sort of occupying forces and reinforced by occupying forces. So I would not be surprised, the next thing you know, the Germans are going to use the mafia to rule Italy. I think it's not going to be surprising. It's probably the most effective way to rule Italy. So the point is, when you have an unification with one side ruling the other, and no political representation, because the thing that, again, I'm sorry if I enter too much into Italian history, but when Italy got unified, there was a system of representation that was based either on your income or your ability to read and write. However, a bit like the US Constitution, the seats in Parliament were allocated to a number of people, not a number of people writing or reading. So in the South, there were a lot of people, very few who knew how to read and write. So basically, the barons in the South were able to control a lot of the electoral seats. And so what did the North do is ally with who represented Italy. There were a few barons in the South, and make sure that those barons were well taken care of, and the rest of the country was good. And this is not different from what Germany and Italy, or Germany and Greece, because we have no representation in Germany, and the only one who have some form of representation, take Greece, not to always talk about Italy, are who? Are the people who speak English, have sort of well-connected European level, who end up to be basically the Greek oligarchs. So the Greek oligarchs are very well treated by the European Commission, but the ordinary Greek people are not, exactly like the sort of north and south of Italy. And we know that story, we know how it ends, and that's the reason why I'm concerned.
So it's almost impossible, it is impossible, it's almost impossible to refrain from rebutting some of the statements. For example, I think that the European unification was very popular in Italy, for example, when it happened.
Sure, but I didn't understand what it meant.
Well, but it was. I think that there was a serious issue of distribution of income and wealth between Sicily and the Emilia-Romagna when the Italian unification happened, which then fits into your story about the difference in the literature unit. So there are differences that are important. But we'll keep that for later, and now we will instead ask Joe to tell us about this book. It's some optimistic take.
No, I think you've gotten the most optimism that you can get. Let me begin by saying that in a way, as I read the history of the euro, it really was a visionary project that was intended to bring greater prosperity to Europe, and by bringing more shared prosperity and leading to a convergence of the countries to lead to more European solidarity. So it was supposed to be a positive, virtuous circle. It was born in a particular moment of history, and Marcus referred to this already. Economists often talk about counterfactual history. What would have happened if it had been born at another moment of history? The particular moment of history was after the Latin American crisis, before the East Asian crisis, and before the 2008 crisis. Why is that important? Well, the Latin American crisis was a debt crisis. The countries had borrowed too much in the belief that interest rates would remain low, and then the United States, not worrying about the rest of the world, you talked about a hegemon who pursues their own interest, raised interest rates to a level that no one had ever anticipated before. When the Fed did, one of my friends who was on the board at the time said, do you realize, said to the chairman, do you realize that you're going to cause the Latin American debt crisis? And his response was, my responsibility is to America. And if a couple 100 million people suffered, that's their problem. And he didn't say that part, but that was the implication of that policy. And it's all been represented here. They weren't represented an American democracy. And so we had a monetary policy that did get inflation down, but led to a lost decade in Latin America. So at that time, 1992, we had just won the war. The Iron Curtain had fallen. And we thought the defeat, the fall of the Iron Curtain, reflected the success of the market economy. It didn't. It reflected the failure of communism. So we thought the market economy is great, just keep away from debt, just make sure you don't have Latin American style inflation, and the market will take care of everything. So a set of ideas about, sometimes called neoliberalism, was predominant in 1992 at the time of Maastricht. And that all changed by 1997 because the East Asia crisis, the East Asian countries had surpluses, had no inflation, and yet there's a major crisis caused by what? The private sector and by the wrong rules that the U.S. had used its political influence to impose on East Asia, particularly the issue of capital market liberalization, that, well, capital would flow in and then it flowed out, causing devastation. So it was rules, but it was the wrong rules. If you have the wrong rules, you get disastrous results. And then the question is, how do you want to respond to the wrong rules? Do you want to say we're going to force them until we die, or do you jump out of the pot? So the history, if it had, and by 2008, we realized that deregulation didn't work, free markets don't work, that you needed to have a strong regulatory structure to make a market economy work. So market economies can work, but only with the right structure. And that the idea that simply keeping deficits low, keeping debt low relative to GDP, and keeping inflation low would lead to convergence. If you created a common currency, I think it was viewed as, today would be viewed as nonsense, almost everywhere. I say almost everywhere because it's still being believed by some people in some parts of Europe. Well, there's one more aspect of this, and that is there was a theory of reform at the founding of the euro, because it was very clear. There was a literature at the time that made it very clear, and that literature didn't go far enough, that the diverse countries of Europe that were forming the Eurozone did not satisfy the conditions under which a single currency could work. And you needed certain institutions that have been referred to by Luigi, and they weren't there. And the theory of reform was, well, let's get this project going, and it will still work well enough. And the momentum then will be to make sure that it will work. And so that was a theory of reform. Well, we know what happened. There wasn't any reform. And we're now being told, optimistically, and I hope he's right, that as Europe faces a crisis, the Eurozone faces a crisis, finally the reform will come. But the question of which reform, under whose idea, will be dictated from one part of Europe or another, and will it actually happen? So that's where my pessimism comes, that I'm not convinced that this theory of reform actually works. And so far it has not worked. So let me first, it was founded, as I say, with two ideas that would lead prosperity and solidarity. I think what Luigi said is absolutely right. It has, in terms of economics, been a disaster. All of the peripheral countries, all the countries, half of the Eurozone, are in depression that is greater than the Great Depression. And so, if you're in these countries, you don't feel so good. And what is so clear is that depression, these countries aren't going to recover quickly from that depression. what's happening is some of the most talented people are leaving the country. So the Eurozone and the EU created a framework that actually makes recovery in some sense more difficult because you get a hollowing out of these countries. You have place-based debt, which means that countries with a large debt, like Italy or Greece, you can just leave the country and not pay back the debt. The idea of place-based debt in a framework with that kind of free mobility doesn't make any sense. Now, I think there's agreement among every one of us that for the EU to work, for the Eurozone to work, they needed to have a banking union. And let me try to explain why that's so important. The hope was that, as I say, the countries of the Eurozone would converge. The facts are they diverged. They got further and further apart. So that's another example of a failure. And what are the reasons why it's diverged? What are the reasons why every IMF program has been disastrously wrong in their forecast about what's happened? Well, one of the reasons has to do with the lack of the banking union, and the most important part of the banking union that Luigi emphasized, which is common deposit insurance, which, while they've agreed to the principle, is sometime in the future. Why is that so important? Well, backing any country's financial system, banks, are the government. Now, we think of these as free market economies. Anybody who thinks about it for a minute knows we have a mixed economy. In 2008, after the after the financial crisis which began in the United States, where did money flow? Money flew into the United States. Was it because our banks proved that they knew how to manage risk? No, that was a rhetorical question. They had shown that they were disastrous in managing money and managing risk. Why did money flow? Well, I was on a conference call right after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, where the Democratic Party was trying to decide on its response to Paulson's idea of a $700 billion bailout of the banks. And most of the people on the conference call were bankers, and their first question is, why only $700 billion? And the answer was, well, $2 trillion seemed too big. But don't worry, this is just the first installment. If you need more, there's more there. So the point of all this is that standing behind the banking system is the government. If Spain is weak, money leaves the Spanish banking system, and as it leaves, lending goes down, the economy gets weaker, the Spanish gets weaker, and Germany gets stronger. So I've been told I have 2 minutes, so let me just come to the bottom line. So in my analysis, the fundamental problem is the structure of the Eurozone itself. It's the rules of the Eurozone that are flawed at birth, and the question really is, can they be easily changed? If you are optimistic about the change, then and the changes that are needed are, I think, not agreed upon within Europe. And I think there are. I think what Luigi talked about were the broad range of changes, but that will entail some ideas like Eurobonds. There may be ways of doing it with less liability, but it's still a fundamental common borrowing. So the fundamental flaw is the structure of the Eurozone, not the structure of individual countries. These countries that are doing badly today actually grew faster before the euro. And that's true not only of Italy, but many of the other countries grew faster than the average of Europe before the creation of the euro. So, and certainly before 2008. So whatever it was, it didn't suddenly change in 2008. There weren't new laws that passed in 2008 that made these countries not be able to function. It was, everybody said the euro would impede the ability to adjust and to a shock, and that's precisely what happened. The problems in the structure of the Eurozone were compounded by the policies. But some of the reasons for the failed policies have to do with something that all of the speakers have talked about. Austerity is one example of a very different vision of what makes for good macroeconomics. But also the structural reforms. The structural reforms were not structural reforms that were designed to promote economic growth. One of them I talked about in the book, for instance. One of the structural reforms in Greece was a demand that Greece change the definition of fresh milk. They say, you know, the fire is burning, Greece is going into a deep depression, and the European leaders are discussing, should fresh milk be defined as 4 days or 10 days? And Greece says 4 days, and the European Commission, the Troika says 10 days. That's the argument. Exactly, okay. So you ask the question, what is this about, 4 days versus 10 days? It's about special interest, and politics in Europe is about individual country interest and special interest. So milk from Northern Europe, the Netherlands, wants to be able to ship down to Greece, worsening Greece's balance of payments, worsening the economy of Greece, and that's called structural reform. And that's the kind of demand that was imposed. Well, so I've been told 0 minutes. It seems to me what the first best thing would be, and I hope this book is right, that there's enough solidarity that they, in the midst of a crisis, will be able to do all the things that I think are necessary to make the euro work. But I'm not as optimistic about that. And I think Luigi is right, it's not going to be costless, but the current system is not costless. Remember, it's a depression that's greater than the Great Depression. And then the question is, you know, paying those fixed costs. And what I try to describe in the book is a way of doing it in which those costs would be, I think, manageable. So let me stop there.
Maybe just one word. I would like to put on the table which reforms exactly. Certainly Luigi and Joe think are the primary reforms that we should be talking about, so that we know what the discussion is. Because Luigi talked about reforming the ECB, and giving more power to the ECB to act like a normal central bank.
And I would add inflation. Moving away from just inflation targeting to growth and employment.
So the tools and the mandate of the ECB. Then I have the banking union, completing the banking union, and making sure that they common deposit insurance.
And that's the key reform, as well as common resolution. Because, you know, if the state of Washington had to bail out Washington WAMU when it went bankrupt in 2008, the state of Washington would also be bankrupt.
And then there is common fiscal policy. This is exceedingly ambitious. Do we need it? Absolutely.
Yeah, because when you have a severe economic downturn, you go into, your revenues go down and your expenditures go up. So you have to have, not the same degree as the United States, but you have to have the ability, what I talk about is a solidarity fund for stabilization. So you have to be able to share some of the burden of an economic downturn so that you can finance unemployment insurance and increase in welfare payments that come when you go into a recession or depression.
So these are bigger requirements, necessary and sufficient.
No, there are more. So I think, you know, well, it's something, you know, I think we need some version and some of the ideas that were mentioned before, some new version of a Eurobond. And, you know, the question is, can you do that without, so you need some version of common borrowing. And I think we would agree on that. And the question is, can you do it within the framework of you might say, the German mentality. And I think the kind of suggestions that are interesting and questions, would they satisfy that? I also think you need some degree of what I call industrial policy. Industrial policy are policies that enable the countries that are below to catch up to those that are above. It won't happen automatically by markets. So some of the idea was in that neoliberal moment back in the 90s, there was an idea that markets would just converge if you just had low deficits and debt. And that's not true.
Reading your, I was thinking that at the moment, I mean, you give a pretty great picture of the euro and the way which evolves in a negative way, and I was thinking, you know, at the doomsday clock, and that represents the countdown to a catastrophic event and so on. I have the impression that, I mean, in the reading that you have in the history of these 20 years of the euro, that, I mean, the evolution of the time is always moving close to midnight, and so you go from, let's say, 10 minutes to midnight to 1 minute, well, now, or maybe 30 seconds. But the reality, I mean, what we are seeing is that, I mean, these two times, at least, when we were in the book of Markus K, we have been probably 1 minute, but after, I mean, there's been a reaction that you can say that it was insufficient partial and so on, but we have moved away from the 1 minute. We have moved 5 to 3 to 10, depends on the thing. And I think that the reading is that you're not recognizing that during this 5-6 year of crisis, there has been, however, some progress. And therefore, you find yourself in 1 minute to midnight. Why I think that we are a little bit far away.
I forget what they call it, but the Association of Atomic Physicists used to have in their journal a clock to midnight. And it used to get very close, and then there'd be some agreement that would move away, and then it get close. So I would describe Europe more like that it's a game of brinkmanship. And the danger of brinkmanship is that when you get, there's always a danger that you go over the brink. And you can say, you know, there are two things that are not fully under your control: politics and markets. And so UK represents the dangers of politics. They didn't plan to go over that brink, but they did. And one could see a series of events where another country has a referendum and on the euro, and it could go the other way. If you ask, you know, in last year you had the 2015, they had the euro crisis. They, quote, solved it. Does anybody really think they really solved it? The depression in Greece got worse. The policies predictably made that depression worse. Just to give you a view about where the markets are, the Economist Intelligence Unit puts more than puts a 60% probability that Greece will be out of the Eurozone by 2020. That's 3 years from now. So that's not solved. Now, whether that will, whether that will happen, but this is where markets come in. If markets get panicked and they take that seriously, they can start leaking. Even before that doomsday clock, in the doomsday clock, markets were not going to set off the atomic bomb as a preventive measure. But markets may, as a preventive measure for their own protection, pull money out of Italy or pull money out of any of these countries. And then that crisis that you described, it will happen before the decision has been made to leave. And then you will have to make a decision.
Yeah, I think that Joe puts the hurdle so high that basically he's doing the euro to fail. I am actually a bit more optimistic because I don't want it to fail. I would like it to succeed. So I think that my view of the fiscal policy is more moderate. In the sense, I actually am sympathetic to the Germans who say, I don't want to put in common our liabilities because that's unfair. And I think it's true. It's to say they have been more thrifty than the Italians. Why to share the liabilities? I think that makes perfect sense. And the clever thing that Markus and company have designed is very clever to fix the lack of sort of safe assets, but it's not a fix to create a fiscal policy, a common fiscal policy. I think the obvious sort of subject that should be dealt with is a European unemployment insurance. Because I think that Joe is absolutely right that given the budgetary rules, if you are hit by a recession, this creates a spiral. You lack automatic stabilizer, create a spiral that will lead the country into a deep depression. And the beautiful thing about a sort of unemployment insurance is that while there might be moral hazard at the individual level, you cannot blame the country. It's not that the country is entirely sort of not trying to get people employed, because that's not what they try to do. Number two, you can design this policy to be deviation vis-a-vis the structural level of unemployment. So it creates an incentive for the country to reduce the structural level, because in a crisis, you get more money when your structural level is lower. So as the virtuous component of all the reform that Germany is pushing. And if you say, because at the end it pushed down to this, the Germans will never trust the Italian not to cheat on their employment insurance. That's the sort of at the bottom line. I say, wait a minute, why don't we have the German minister in Italy and the Italians in Germany? After all, this is basically what we do with the European banking union. So why don't we do with the unemployment? And in a moment in which Europe is challenged, what is more popular than having a check with a European sign that gives you survival when you're unemployed? This is the best publicity for Europe you can do. And you say, look, we have a banking union, we have a banking insurance, we have also a people's insurance. Listen, it seems to me such a no-brainer that I cannot believe that smart people like there are at this European institution have not considered it. In fact, they have, and I don't know why, who is staying against. So actually, let me put it cold turkey. I want a statement by Markus. Are you in favor or against this type of unemployment insurance?
Just answer that. It's written in our book that we want it. Good. It's one of the measurement areas, was one of the first one proposing.
That actually proves my point that I said every economist worth this name, and you're definitely one of those, is in favor. And I wanted just to test it.
Let me just defend Germany a little bit, given that we give this great attack beforehand. You know, if you plot the GDP growth of Italy and Germany until the middle of 2000, Germany was not doing well at all. Let's start from a common point. Germany was the sick man of Europe, and Germany was cutting wages, in a sense, but the reason was not to take advantage of with respect to the other Europeans. It was essentially the opening towards Eastern Europe. There was a huge outsourcing wave towards Eastern Europe, and that's why Germany had to react to that. Without the reaction, we had huge unemployment rate, and that was the intention was not somehow to drive Italy into difficulties. Essentially, it was to react to the outsourcing wave, and the choice was essentially at that time should be open up towards Eastern Europe and try to bring Eastern Europe up back to the European level, which I think was a huge success. But this would pressure Germany quite a lot, and that's why there was a wage cut or wage reduction in Germany. What's about, I think what we should also keep in mind is that we always say, oh, the euro was the cause of all these problems, that's why we have this crisis. How would we look like without the euro? We would have a huge crisis too. It's just, you know, you would be cut off right away. We have this huge target 2 system, a huge way of cushioning essentially things. Without the euro, it would have been perhaps potentially even more dramatic. Of course, you wouldn't have perhaps gone into such a huge crisis, but the build-up of the initial phase was more dramatic. So if you have some snake arrangement or something else, it's not, we had a lot of crises before the euro as well. On the deposit insurance, I should say that if you read our book, it was Mario Monti. Berkeley didn't really fully agree to it. Mario Monti just announced it was agreed, and she was sleeping. And then she woke up and said, no, and then it sounded like she backtracked.
So who was leading?
There was a summit that lasted till 5 in the morning or whatever. And then at 6 in the morning, Mario Monti announced, oh, there's a big breakthrough, we achieved that. But it was not to such a detail agreed what Mario Monti. That's what in European politics, they push things forward. Of course, what the Germans are very worried is that legacy problems will be, lost here. So there's a difference between legacy problems and going forward. The Germans were always very concerned, legacy problems, you have to deal with them, but going forward, there could be some assurance.
I completely agree, and I think that I like sort of, this is where I'm on your side and not Joe's side. Joe tends to sort of push under the rug the incentives, and I believe very much in incentives. And so I'm very sympathetic to the German position on this. But the thing that has not been discussed enough is the reason why, and also I think Joe does not recognize this in his book, the reason why we had this shrinking of the difference in yields before the euro crisis was not driven by the fact that the market is crazy. It was driven by the fact that the European Central Bank had chosen a policy that in my view was wrong. Because for people who are not familiar with the banking sector, but there is a rule from Basel II that says that if you invest, if you are a bank and you invest in your country-owned debt, that debt is considered risk-free from a capital requirement point of view. And it's not that crazy because if you are in a sovereign country, the sovereign will not default, will print money, will inflate, but not default. So considering risk-free was not a bad idea. Now clearly when the ECB was created, when the euro was created, you had a problem. How do you treat the debt of various sovereign when in fact you don't have a sovereign central bank? And at that time they should have said, no, either we create a policy of intervention of the ECB or we should not consider this as risk-free debt. But they did, and it's not a fault of Greece, it's not a fault of Italy, it's not a fault of anybody, it's the fault of the ECB, okay? And that of course compressed the yield until the moment where sort of they realized that this couldn't happen. So now, speaking of legacy problem, there is a very simple way to fix the problem. You say, okay, we ECB have made a mistake, we pay for it. So now we have a bunch of debt we bought from all these countries, we forgive that debt, we cancel it. That's the legacy problem. From now on, we impose the right rules. That are the rules that you can, the debt is not risk-free, and Italy has to, every country has to go down, and so on and so forth. So that's a perfect solution in which you deal with the legacy on the one hand, and you have the right incentive moving forward. So, Markus, are you joining me also on this?
I don't think the Italians, so that's a big debate at the moment with the risk weights, how much risk weights to put on it. Italy is strictly opposed to it.
I know, but that's not Italian. That's not Italian, but I don't represent Italy. I just say my position.
Let me just one last word to Greece. I think I'm much more worried that the markets will run against Italy or some other countries because in Greece almost all the debt is official, so there's almost no market left. So
I was thinking about Italy. Yeah. Can I just try to defend myself for a second?
Because Moreno is pointing out that we have completely lost control of the panel, which I consider a great measure of success. So I'm delighted with that. I'm also having fun. But, okay, so...
Okay, so that was a statement to be brief. Okay, so there are two issues here I want to bring up. The first is, one of the things that the euro resulted in was countries borrowing in a currency not directly in their own control. So the United States borrows in dollars. We will never have a sovereign debt crisis like European countries because what we owe, we print. And the only way that we would not repay what we owe is if the electricity supply came out or something like that. But I saw, when I was chief accountant at the World Bank in 98 crisis, these were countries that borrowed in dollars. They don't control dollars, and they didn't have dollars, and that was the sovereign debt crisis that you've seen all over the world. And that's what Europe created when they had borrowing by individual sovereigns in a currency not under their control. Now, the rationality or irrationality of the markets, one of the things I try to argue in the book is that the markets were somewhat irrational in that the yield spreads came way down before 2008. They thought because the exchange rate had been eliminated, the sovereign risk had been eliminated, but it obviously hadn't. Now, what Luigi's pointed out is that a lot of this debt was held by government, but there was also a lot of debt, or some debt, still held by the private sector. And you have to say, how could anybody in the private sector rationally think that the probability of default of Greece at that time was minusculely different from the probability of default of Germany? And there's no way you could say that those were rational. And this is not only about European debt, this was also true about risk spreads all over. Basically, one of the things that we learned when interest rates get relatively low, the search for yield, as it's called, leads to behavioral finance that leads to spreads that, ex post, seem to make no sense. And that is another example of the excessive faith in markets that in 1992 led to a set of rules that has since been, we've seen, led to a lot of instability and a lot of divergence and a lot of crises.
I think we need to come back to some order here, so I would like to ask Moreno, please.
So as you know, I mean, I'm the bad guy, the European Commission of the rule, and as a European civil servant for now more than 25 years, I imagine I also qualify as a member of what Luigi calls the Leninist revolutionary vanguard, composed by European technocrats, and claims the right to create the conditions to make integration inevitable. Well, I would like to say a lot about the accuracy of such a statement, as well as also justice on the fact that the EU is driven by a bunch of market fundamentalists, but I will leave this for the dinner. And in order to leave about half an hour to the public to have a discussion, I mean, I would like to wrap up a little bit the discussion that we had here in my question that I would like to ask. So the question is, and Joe already said, what are the, since political capital is limited in Europe, what are the three most important measures that Europe should take in the next 18 months? And you can also say why you might disagree with some of the proposals that the other speakers are made. How long do you want to start?
Sure. I think you need a story where you stretch out a vision of what needs to be done. So some of the things are very short term, and some of them have a longer term run. So in the book, this state asset scheme is discussed, the banking union scheme is discussed. I think if you think in the light of the story of the multiple crises, one of the big infrastructure investments that's really required, and I agree that with Joe's comment that this can only come with a public sector involvement, is a connection of Europe's energy markets. They're very, very disconnected, and there are enormous gains to be made, in part also gains in security policy, and it's an important one, but it's one that the European Commission is actually pushing. You've had the discussion of the energy union, and it requires an investment program. I think in the longer term, it's been talked about already, the unemployment insurance, the social insurance in general, is more important than getting other elements of the fiscal union. And that the key thing about the unemployment insurance or sickness insurance as well is that if you think that lots of Europeans are moving from one country to another, I mean, that's one of the features of modern Europe, and they need to be properly insured. So but the advantage of that is that you then get the flows that take place with individuals building up claims on the system, and individuals having liabilities in terms of making payments in, but you don't get whole states making the claims and getting the benefits. And the moment that this becomes politicized in terms of state getting big transfers, you really blow the system up. And I think if you had a system where New York or New Jersey would explicitly subsidize Michigan or the Rust Belt states, you would also get a problem in the United States. And the thing that really makes the United States work, I mean, in that sense, a lot of the debate about whether you need Alexander Hamilton and the fiscal consolidation seems to be misplaced. I mean, what really made the United States work as a modern country is Social Security in the 1930s. And it's built up on a very modest level. So I think if you think of the European social insurance developing alongside the national insurance, which is a model that looks attractive and is an answer to the question of mobility, which is a very, very important question for Europe.
Yes, I will make it short. So I think Europe needs two things. One is a vision for the long run, where the whole thing will go, and also how to create a more European identity. You know, we are proud of German firms or French firms and all this. Why don't we have so few European firms, even though they're de facto European? It's essentially just Airbus. And we need some things Europeans can form a common identity. We have to think carefully about that. So that's one thing, is the vision. And then the other thing is for the short term, some concrete measures. And it should be concrete measures we can do without a big treaty change. You know, all parliaments have to agree and do the referendum. And that's where we think the SPs for the safe asset can come in. But we also think it has to be something very realistic people can feel and see. Another dimension is the refugee crisis. That the Europeans say, okay, we do something together on the European side, perhaps in a flexible way because not all the countries will participate. And again, as Harold pointed out, the unemployment insurance is something which people can see. So it has to be something which really touches the average person in Europe. But more generally, I think we need some ideas union. We push for this, so have go some new ways and provide some new ideas where Europe takes some ideas, leadership, saying, oh, here's some new ways of going. Just copying others might not be creative enough to excite young people and go forward. So this, but you know, we talk about European IMF and other things, some stability measures, which might be too difficult at this stage to implement. But just let's do the things we can implement, but at the same time also have a long-term vision for the whole thing is going and also building a European identity.
So when the euro was formed, when the monetary union was formed, there was this idea that we throw sort of the cart ahead of the horse. It doesn't go that well, but we sort of jump ahead of what we can today because eventually things will be fixed. And there is a very famous interview actually by Moreno Bertoldi, who's one of the founder of the euro, in 2000, 2001 on the Financial Times, is saying, we know perfectly well that the European monetary union, the way it was created, is not sustainable. However, in this moment, we couldn't build those institutions, but there will be a crisis. This is always, and when the crisis will come, those institutions will be formed. And this is very much a Jean Monnet idea that the Europe will be formed down the crisis, and every crisis will move far forward, etc. Now, Bertoldi was absolutely right on the first statement, was very prescient on the second, completely wrong so far on the third. Okay? We're 17 years into a marriage that we started out of love, and now we're saying, wait a minute, in 17 years there should be something else other than love, right? And all the things you are hoping when you are engaged, you hope that there is something else. and they're not calm. They're not calm. So I think this idea of saying we're going to do things for the long term, guys, the long term, we're not going to be there, like Ken said. So I think that either we have a push now, or it will fall apart. There's no doubt to me that this is the case. And so I think there is no enough sense of urgency. I actually was hoping, was sort of a paradox, but I was hoping that the Brexit shock could be a therapy shock. And after Brexit, people are like, this is not going to work, because if we keep saying the idea of Europe like we've said so far, it's not going to work. The Remain campaign was a disaster because there was no big idea. It was simply saying the status quo. So I was hoping that there would be like a reaction, and all of a sudden there would be a push forward. And Bratislava was a disaster. And in addition to that, we have a gigantic immigration crisis that we not know how to deal with. It says, if Europe could be useful on another thing out of the economics, is the immigration crisis. And we go like a lot of separate nations in which we put boundaries. Now, all of a sudden, we help this and guy or that guy, like Turkey, just to keep them away, but there's not a common policy about immigration. And I think that it's not going to work until we really do a major push now.
Joe has to answer still, but I wanted to come in because I thought that we were being, I liked very much the tone we were taking, which seemed to me more pragmatic, a little bit humbler, things that can be done, that's all agreed. I like unemployment insurance. Everybody here agreed. Maybe it could be done, right? So I like that. Let's focus on things that maybe could be done. Your vision is that, yes, it's a disaster. By the way, I completely agree with you on the immigration and refugees. Completely agree with you. But that's a huge political problem. So let's try to be technical and small and modest and see if we can make some pragmatic suggestions. I like this one.
I think
common editorial, all of you, send it out.
no, and I think the view of this as part of creating or strengthening the European identity, like the Erasmus program has helped create a European identity, are examples. And what I've been arguing, in effect, is the Eurozone was not a good idea for creating that European identity. And if it continues to be as divisive as it has been, then I think we may have to abandon the euro to save the EU. The euro interacts with, and the failures interact with, and this is, with the migration crisis. Why? Well, if you have large numbers of countries in Europe with high levels of unemployment, the migrants don't want to go there, and the countries don't want more people joining the unemployment lines and competing for jobs. If Europe were functioning, it would be economically, it would be much more able to address the migrant crisis. So, in my mind, the euro crisis and the migrant crisis are actually intimately related, and so it's inevitable that migrants are going to go to Germany, to the UK, countries with low unemployment rate.
But Germany has accepted the migrants, has welcomed the migrants, and it looks to me like there should be a yellow card, right? Maybe we could even push to some fiscal expenditure, which will have to be done. It would be one way to have some fiscal expansion in Germany.
That's right.
It could
I think that's good.
a way maybe of getting Europe as a whole to be a little bit younger, given that Germany first, but Italy very much, and many other countries are getting so old. So
it's also clear, isn't it, that Italy and Greece are really on the forefront of the migration issue, and in that sense,
it's a bargaining chip.
But exactly. So, if you say you need fiscal transfers because an economics textbook tells you that you need that in order to make monetary union work, voters won't believe you. But if you say you need fiscal transfers because there are refugees coming to Greece and Italy, that's something that everybody sees, and that works. I mean, in that sense, that's exactly the way in which I think the argument that multiple crises are forcing this
It's very much in line.
is important.
Yeah. So we have unemployment insurance, we have the refugees. I see this op-ed forming in front of my eyes. I do have one question for everybody, but we don't have much time, so I ask you please to give me short answers if possible. I'd like to come back to Italy, both because I'm Italian and I care, but also because it is a paradigmatic case, I think, of the failures of the Eurozone. And there are some things reading the three books that confuse me. So Joe and Luigi agree that the Eurozone has worked against Italy. Okay. But in Luigi's case, I understand Joe's argument, but in Luigi's case I'm more confused because Luigi also tells us that in fact the long-term problems of Italy are the lack of productivity and the bad institutions, effectively, the bad institutional culture. Neither of which seems to me would have been necessarily helped by a flexible exchange rate. So then maybe Italy should, as I guess you imply, solve that. It's not so much that the Eurozone has worked against Italy, it's that Italy has been unable to take the opportunity that it had. In terms of the discussion of Italy, there is also a discussion, a chapter on Italy in the book by Harold and Markus, and there I was puzzled too, because my reading is Italy has done poorly because it didn't go through the structural reforms that it had to do. But in fact, let's take a couple of examples. Pensions. You don't talk about the Monti reform on pensions. My understanding is that Italy has the most sustainable pension system of all the Eurozone countries as of now. Or I checked the claims that the labor markets are so steady, flexible, and so much protection. According to the OECD number that I saw yesterday, an index, a summary index of labor market protection in 2013 at the same value for Germany and Italy. Maybe we are not looking at the right thing. Maybe there is an issue about what the social relations are. But in terms of the structure of the labor market, it's not obvious in the numbers that I see. So, to me, Italian, there was a little bit in reading the chapter of the misapprehension by the North of what's really happening in the South. And so it came back to this problem of cultures. But cultures are also in the interpretation we give to the facts. And so it becomes dangerous because that means, well, dangerous, not dangerous, but something to talk about because we see different things when we look at the same facts.
So I think we take Italy also as a microcosm of Europe. I mean, I think that's indeed very, very plausible. And there's a really radical difference in different parts of Italy. But then you also see what part of the problem is. So if you think of what's producing some of the inflexibility, it's a common pay rate for a very, very large civil service across the country. So that civil servants in an enormous public sector, public servants are paid uncompetitively well in the South, so that nobody wants to do private enterprise, and very badly in the North, so that they don't act properly in civil servitude, you don't feel you're properly paid if you're a civil servant. And that's an example, actually, of where rethinking the Italian problem is also a way of rethinking the European problem, because what you really need in this kind of circumstance is a really good principle of subsidiarity, which is also one of the things that's written into Europe. So it's not just an Italian problem. Other countries have this issue of public sector pay as a drag in poorer areas. So that's one of the areas that we really think of these solutions.
I think that the question you're raising is a very good one, and one I've been struggling a lot, because it's definitely true that the Italian problem predated the euro. Now, clearly, during this crisis, the euro has exacerbated the problem. Now the question is, by taking away the euro, are you making them better or worse? And I think that the turning point are a couple of things. One is the fact, as you say, that all the reforms that Europe has pushed turned out to be completely irrelevant. There was all this big emphasis on flexibility of labor, Article di Charter, etc. Zero impact. Of course, if you subsidize people to hire, they're going to hire more. We know that. But at the rate of 25,000 euro per new employee, sort of, you're basically pay them to hire them. So, which is public job is called. It's not called the subsidy for a private job. So basically, all the proposals done by the European Union, the so-called structural reform, have not worked. And the ultimate European cabinet, which was Mario Monti, sorry to say because I know you're a student of Mario, was a complete disaster. Okay? In terms of like doing a change, actually he passed one norm that very few people know that was very good. There was a limit on cross shareholdings, a cross directorship in corporate Italy, which was very good, but nobody paid attention to that. Everything else is a survival of the status quo. So the problem in Italy, in my view, is not the inflexibility of the labor, is an inflexibility of the capital and the sort of backwardness of our entrepreneurship class. And this is the one that basically Europe so far has defended, including, I was hoping at least that with the banking sector, they would clean up a lot, and in part they have. But, you know, Montepaschi, they appoint the new CEO. The new CEO has to be authorized by the ECB. The new CEO has been sanctioned by the Bank of Italy for irregular behavior. The ECB let him be appointed. I don't know why. So if Europe fails to do that for Italy, what is the advantage?
Just very, because I know you want to open it up to discussion. I think this is illustrated a couple of points. First, it's one of the theories that was put forward was that the crises in individual countries would enable Europe to force reforms that were needed in the individual countries. And I think the lesson, both of Greece and Italy and these other countries, is you can't get reforms forced from other countries that make sense. They're almost always going to be badly designed. And you talked about the example in the Italian bank. There's exactly the same kind of example going on in Greece, where the woman who was the most strongest fighter against the Greek oligarchs and the control of the banking system, Europe is trying to force her out of her position. So, you know, you can see in instance after instance a lack of knowledge of the details leading to wrong policies. The other point I make is that Euro, and this is Luigi Zingales, is not the only problem, and solving the Euro won't solve all problems. But what is true is it exacerbates the current problems, and even, you know, countries with bad structures are going to have lower standards of living. The question is, do they have to have 50%, 60% youth unemployment? Do they have to have depressions worse than the Great Depression? That didn't happen before the Euro. So yes, structural reforms are important, and voters should be demanding that in the democratic process and say, look at that country, our neighbor is doing better than we are because they have done certain things. But it needs to be a democratic process and not forced from the outside in an undemocratic way.
We open up to questions in order to be able to take the make as many as possible. We go at group of three.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I have a question concerning currency, but before that, if you allow a short comment on your unemployment insurance idea. I don't know how many of you have talked to people, for example, in Germany, that had some things with uninsurance, or that, with unemployment insurance, and that were sometimes unemployed. I hired and fired many people in my business, and so I talked to many of them. And the thing is, I think if people get really, angry on the German state, it's when they are confronted with the unemployment insurance, because it's so bureaucratic and it's the most bad experience you can have with that state. So I would strongly recommend not to make a European unemployment insurance, because then people would just think, oh, that's really a bureaucratic shithouse. So perhaps we have to think more about basic income or so if you really want to do a good thing for Europe and non-bureaucratic. So that was just my comment on that idea. And the other thing I just wanted to ask is, you know that we are, so to say, entering in a new age of currency because of the cyber currencies, this blockchain, etc., Bitcoin, you know, all of that. And you also know probably that Fed and Bank of England is currently considering whether it makes sense to issue a central bank-backed cyber currency. So if that is in the next 50 years coming, why should we stick to the idea of having just one currency in an area of 28 countries? Why shouldn't we just allow to have multiple currencies, to have Italy issue its own cyber currency, perhaps even two different ones, so that the states get the sovereignty about this currency and can also devaluate if that's necessary, or do also other things, so that we would have like a parallel currency system. Thanks.
Yes. I think please introduce yourself when.
I'm an economist working at the University of Bonn in Germany. Markus and Harold had this great way of sort of cutting through complexity with their book and sort of really juxtaposing the ideas. So I come away thinking that like sort of the simplest way to summarize things is that everything that's macroeconomically desirable is a political economy catastrophe, and everything that's possible from the point of view of political economy is a macroeconomic catastrophe. And the unemployment insurance won't get us out of the depression that Joe rightly diagnosed. So what are the concrete steps macroeconomically that we can take to increase growth and youth unemployment, or reduce it at least in Europe, without committing like sins in terms of political economy that we'll regret for the next 2 generations?
Hi, Rudy Costanzo. I'm actually an economist working for an private investment bank. Quick question, actually 2 questions. First of all, I'd like to posit the idea that in the short term, the monetary, fiscal, and banking problems in the euro are actually resolved. That's because with OMT, you have a transfer union with conditionality. With the ECB, again, you have unlimited liquidity for the banking sector. And with ECB, again, because you have the OMT, you won't have a fiscal crisis because the ECB will intervene. So to me, the problem is not in the short term. Actually, in the short term, I agree in terms of the reforms that need to be done. My biggest concern is actually in the medium term, when Mario Draghi's term ends in 4 years' time, and if we have again Axel Weber or someone like him getting into the ECB throne, because then we're going to have some serious problems. And then the other question, and then so I would like to comment about that. The other question I would like to put is, with the most intellectual honesty you can muster, how wrong do you think you were in assessing the risks and the growth that happened in Spain and Ireland? Because there, they did the reforms well, and now you're experiencing Spain with growth at 3.2% on a yearly basis without a government for the past 12 months. And in Ireland, you have growth in excess of 5.5% for the last few years. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Mark.
Yes, so that's a good point about the unemployment insurance. I keep this in mind about the bad experience. On cyber currency, I think it's too early to say. It will not come fast enough to bring us out of the current crisis, to go for bitcoins and others. Even if it comes, it's still, you have to figure out in what currency wages are sticky in. And with what currency government bonds are written. So that all of these things will matter, even if you have multiple currencies floating around, which can very well imagine. But the stickiness and in what currencies bond trades and all this, I think this is something which is still open. And if all the bonds are traded still in euro, and if all the wages are sticky in euros, all the other currencies will not help so much. On on Moritz's question about political economy and macro, I like this analogy. I mean, it's a little bit of a dilemma. I hope that we find some intersection which will work. And again, I'm just pushing here on the SPC, European Safe Bond, and the refugee aspects. I think there is something. What's interesting is that on the refugee side, Germany's with Greece and with Italy, they face a common problem. So there are some coalitions which can form, and we can actually bargain about something. On the OMT question, I think OMT was actually never important. It's mostly the QE thing. I agree that in the short run, the financial markets, the crisis mutated essentially from a financial crisis more to a political crisis, because now QE is essentially putting a lid on all that. And as far as I know, Mario Draghi's term is over, not in 4 years, but much earlier. And what I think about Spain, I mean, I must agree that I'm positively surprised about the developments in Spain, but of course there is a bounce back effect, so it's 3.2% is a great growth rate, especially in Ireland. It's going fast. Of course, people are still concerned about the high real estate prices in Ireland and the stability issues. But overall, that's a positive sign. So that's essentially what the German side is pushing, is saying, oh, you need to do the structural reforms and then it will come back. And that's essentially confirming their view. But of course, I think the optimal combination essentially is if you do some structural reforms which help, you supplement them with some fiscal stimulus combination as well, because typically reforms in the short run create uncertainty which depress demand further and might be counterproductive in the short run but help in the long run. So you want to do is combine both. You reward somebody or some country. If you do structural reforms which need to be done, you also have a little bit more fiscal space to maneuver and provide some demand support.
Can I ask a short answer on Spain and Ireland?
Sure.
But short, because I agree with that.
So Marcus mentioned one point, which is the bounce back. The second point I would say is GDP is really a bad measure of economic performance. If most of the citizens are doing badly, their income has gone down, that's not a good thing. I know it's okay for the upper 1% that they're doing well. In the case of Ireland, there's another problem. Ireland has been doing well, basically. GDP number was about 26% the last quarter. That shows they're stealing. They're stealing. The applicant showed how they are using tax policy to steal money and jobs from the rest of Europe. An example of the EU's inability to deal with the really important externalities associated with tax policy. Well, let me just stop there.
I think we have time for one question.
Hi, I'm Steve Eisman. I analyze banks for a living, and I'd like to know if anybody in the panel would like to comment on the two topics du jour in my world, which is the solvency or lack of solvency of the Italian banking system, and the solvency and lack of solvency of Deutsche Bank. And I would argue that both are insolvent, but I'd be curious what somebody in the panel would like to say about it.
I was actually shocked by the previous Italian fellow that works in investment banking. Was so confident that the problem has been solved in the short term. Actually, you probably know something I don't know, because I think we are one bad news away from a bank run. But you know more probably than I do, and I would like to know what it is.
Can I? Oh.
We have one question.
Actually, my name is Giovanni Maino from Banco Italy. I noticed that there was such a general agreement on this unemployment insurance scheme that I wanted to tell you that actually such a proposal had been made in Bratislava by the Italian government. Has a name, which is the European Unemployment Benefit Scheme. And most interestingly, a simulation has been run of this scheme since the beginning of the euro. And as Professor Brunnermeier was mentioning at the beginning, sick man of Europe was Germany. So as a result, all countries from the core and the periphery enjoyed benefits from such a scheme. So unfortunately, this scheme has been discussed for the last 2 years, so there's much less I think, convergence of opinions among politicians than here. So that was encouraging, and I wanted to take the opportunities for you, perhaps, to play in support of such a motion.
Thank you. Let's come back also to the banks, maybe, because I'm very curious about the answers. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, I think the Italian banking system is indeed a really a key problem because of the application of the new rules from the beginning of the year and the insistence that the recapitalization of the Monte dei Paschi is a private sector recapitalization. It can't be the government recapitalization. But how on earth is this private recapitalization really got up? It's got up on a promise of growth, which has to be there. And if the growth doesn't materialize, then this recapitalization is going to fail. The Deutsche Bank story, I think, is a very interesting one, in that the collapse of the share price over the last days has really been driven by the US fine. And it seems to me that this is actually just a sign of something that is really very imminent in the world, a kind of deglobalization in which the United States and Europe are fighting each other, and that it looks, I mean, maybe it's too simple, but it looks like a kind of retaliation. On the one hand, there's the Apple story, and on the other hand, there's the Deutsche Bank fight.
Could not be more wrong. The fine that is being levied on Deutsche Bank is in fact the people who run Deutsche Bank for the last 7 years or so for all bonds. And they waited till the very end. The one thing that has learned from the conspiracy is that he who snitches first gets fined the least. And Deutsche Bank has waited till the very, very last moment because they've been so stubborn about it. And this is retaliation for being stupid.
Absolutely. all of that is completely true. But you know, there's the issue that Citigroup also had a big fine, not all that dissimilar, but then renegotiated it. And the renegotiation of fines is more difficult for a foreign company than for a US company. So it's a kind of transatlantic story, I think.
Maybe we can give it a last word.
Oh, okay. So one of the things I want to say is it illustrates, the Italian case illustrates the difficulty of having single rules operate across a region with a great deal of differences. Because the basic rule of no bailout is one that I'm very basically sympathetic with. But the point is that what happened in Italy was that they sold bonds as if they were ordinary deposits, as if they were certificates of deposit. So you have ordinary individuals who are the bondholders, which is not the case in general in other countries. So in this case, if you don't bail out the bond, if you bail in the bondholders, which is let them take a big haircut, you have a major political problem, but you also have a moral problem of a failure of government to protect their citizens, which has and ought to have very severe political consequences. And so the difficulty of getting uniform policies in very different circumstances is illustrated. Now, what may happen, we were having a discussion before we came here, and one of the things that may happen in Germany is another form of bailout, but under a guise without, so using another set of instruments. One of the things that concerns me in the Italian case and in the encouragement of the private sector bailout is it's using regulatory powers in ways that circumvents the rule of law, because regulators have enormous discretion, and basically the underlying story here, as in the United States, is if you don't help us now, there may be consequences down the line. So there's so many interesting issues in democratic politics, in the politics of democracy, that are being illustrated by these bailouts, and illustrating, I think, some of the real difficulties of having a single currency work over a large group of countries where it's not the individuals who are participating, it's states, and states are going to be looking after their own political interest, and where there's not enough solidarity yet to make a single currency.
We are out of time. Luigi, do you want 30 seconds? No? Well, I hope that you enjoyed this panel half as much as I did. So thank you.